Welcome back. In the previous section, we talked about well-known Windows applications that can be used in Linux as well. Thanks to this, migrating from Windows to Linux doesn't seem all that daunting anymore. In this section, we'll tackle an issue which, as many people think, is the biggest obstacle in moving to Linux. It's about some games and applications frequently used in Windows that have virtually no Linux counterparts. These are actually two aspects of the same issue, so we'll discuss both of them in this unit. Let's first talk about games. There's a multitude of both commercial and non-commercial indie video games available for Linux, although the latter are admittedly more numerous and widely available. Some non-commercial products are surprisingly high quality. In many cases, though, non-commercial doesn't mean that they're freeware, but rather that they cost considerably less than a typical Windows game. On the other hand, a number of those games are indeed available free of charge, and despite limited resources and financial means that their developers have, they're often high-quality products. Many games, especially freeware and non-commercial, can be found in their repositories. It's not really difficult to find them. You can obtain them in the exact same way as other programs and applications. If you can't find the game you're looking for in the repository, which may be due to licensing reasons, or because the game uses binary files coming from commercial distributions, you can usually download an installer from the developer's website. Most such installers are easy to use. I'd recommend the website Happy Penguin, which is a very cool web portal where you can find news about what's currently going on in the world of Linux-based gaming. The website presents information on both commercial and non-commercial products that are produced exclusively for Linux. This means that if you want to play such a game on Linux, you're not going to need any emulators and such. So this web portal presents both commercial products, originally designed for other platforms, but ultimately published with a Linux version too, and a number of noteworthy non-commercial and freeware products too. If none of the biggest repositories were involved, it would be difficult for these games to reach a wider audience. While talking about video games for Linux, you can't leave out the Humble Bundle project. This is a collection of games published on semi-regular basis, every few months, by selected independent developers. It's worth mentioning, though, that these aren't necessarily alternative games that are otherwise unavailable, but rather demo versions of products that are well known and widely available for other platforms, such as PC or gaming consoles. The Humble Bundle project allows you to buy a selected collection of games for the price of your choosing. This is a practice that until recently was virtually unknown. Humble Bundle are the first to offer such a possibility. Each buyer pays as much as they're willing to. What's noteworthy is that the user receives a set of games that will work on all of the most popular operating systems: Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, and whose use is not limited by any restrictions, encryption, or passwords. This is a very user-friendly way of distribution, which at the same time contributes to the popularity of Linux as a gaming platform. The website of the project page, humblebundle.com, is worth visiting, even if you still plan to play your games on Windows or Mac OS. In the open source world, users eventually get what they want. If producers do not wish to deliver a product to the market, independent developers do it on their own. It applies both to applications and video games. Many famous games were rewritten for Linux by their fans. Sometimes they're just clones of the original games. For example, there exists a clone of Transport Tycoon Deluxe called Simutrans, and Warcraft 1 was re-implemented for Linux as Freecraft. Nowadays, rather than making an identical copy for Linux, programmers develop an alternative version. This may include using different graphical engine or adding new missions to the game. Therefore, usually, the Linux version is more complex than the Windows original. There's a Linux version of the game The Settlers, called Widelands. Civilization for Linux is called Free Civ. Colonization has a counterpart called Free Col. Many Linux versions of well-known games started out as mere clones, that is, re-implementations of the original products. And the reason they're created was because the original developer wasn't able, or didn't want to, make a version for this platform. But now these games actually far outdo their originals, especially in the case of Simutrans. Simutrans is now a very powerful economics simulator. Right now, Transport Tycoon Deluxe is no match for its Linux version in terms of quality. Classic computer games are also widely available for Linux. We mention this because recently there's been a certain revival in the popularity of arcade games. Hence, interest in this area of the gaming industry keeps growing. A lot of famous games have been re-implemented for Linux. They're almost identical to originals. Their codes have been simply rewritten for Linux. In order not to violate copyrights, usually it's required for users to possess the original version too. A game's implementation contains only the game engine and the application responsible for executing individual sequences of the code, graphics, sound, etc. Artwork, textures, in-game sound effects, and soundtrack must be supplied from the original version. Examples of this type of solution are OpenTTD, an implementation of Transport Tycoon Deluxe for Linux, Pentagram, which allows you to run Ultima 8, OpenRA, thanks to which you can play CNC Red Alert, as well as earlier versions of this game, or OpenMW, which is the open source version of Morrowind. Also, many classic games can be run on Linux directly, just as you do in Windows. For both Linux and Windows, there exists an implementation of the DOSBox tool. Windows users who are interested in how the gaming industry looked 15 years ago, when DOS was still in wide use, will know this tool very well. The implementation of DOSBox for Linux looks exactly like the one you may know from Windows, and all the products that you run there can also safely be run under Linux as well. Newer video games can't be re-implemented or cloned for Linux because they're too big. Also, it would take too much time to create such a version. When a new product hits the market, everyone would like to play it at once. Without delay, the time it would take to implement this from scratch, it could take up to several years. You can also wait for the decision of the game's developer to adapt the game to Linux. Unfortunately, in the case of large commercial productions, this is rather unlikely. From the developer's perspective, Linux users still don't constitute a market big enough to make it profitable to invest resources in implementations for this platform.